Michael Carter was a man in his late 40s, the kind of professional who had built his life on discipline, responsibility, and quiet endurance. For nearly 2 decades, he had walked into the same home every evening, placed his briefcase by the door, and tried to convince himself that the silence greeting him was just fatigue, not absence. His marriage to Laura was not marked by shouting matches or dramatic walkouts. It was something colder, quieter, harder to fight indifference. There had been a time when Laura's laughter filled their house, when her eyes lit up at the mention of simple plans. Dinners out, long walks, trips they dreamed of together, but those days had slipped away. Not in one tragic moment, but little by little, like sand escaping a closed fist. What remained now was a home where 2 people lived under the same roof, yet occupied entirely different worlds. They shared bills, shared space, shared history, but not connection. Michael noticed it most in the small moments. When he came home late after a demanding day, Laura barely looked up from her laptop. When he tried to share a piece of good news from work, her response was little more than a nod before she scrolled on her phone. There were no arguments, no tears, no accusations, just silence. A silence that stretched long enough to make him wonder if their marriage had already ended without either of them signing the papers. Still, Michael clung to the belief that something could be salvaged. He thought perhaps all they needed was distance from routine, a change of scenery. That's why the annual trip had become so important to him. Italy was next on their list. Florence, Rome, and a weekend in Venice. He hoped that walking cobblestone streets, tasting wine in sunlit piazzas, and standing together before timeless art might stir what had gone dormant. He told himself that love needed more than vows, it needed moments, and this trip could give them that chance. Laura seemed to agree. Or at least she didn't resist when the reservations were made. She didn't show much enthusiasm either. But Michael took her silence as acceptance. He convinced himself that once they landed, once they were there together, the spark would find a way back. But just days before departure, his phone rang with a call he could not ignore. The Dallas office needed him. A multi-million-dollar client was threatening to walk away, and Michael had been chosen to lead the negotiation that could save the contract. It was more than a business trip. It was the kind of assignment that could open doors to the next level of his career. A promotion, a seat at the table where decisions were made. That evening, he sat down with Laura, rehearsing in his mind the way he would explain it. He expected frustration at first, but then, understanding. He hoped she would see that this wasn't about abandoning her, but about securing a future for both of them. He imagined her suggesting they postpone, maybe even joking about how Italy would still be there a month later. But when he told her, Laura simply crossed her arms and replied flatly, "Then go. I'm still going. Everything's booked." She didn't look at him when she said it. Her eyes stayed on the screen in front of her, as though his words were nothing more than background noise. Michael stood there, absorbing the weight of her response. There was no anger in her voice, no disappointment, not even an attempt to discuss alternatives, just cold certainty. She would go to Italy, with or without him. In that moment, what hurt wasn't her decision, but her indifference. Indifference, he realized, cut deeper than rage. Rage meant someone still cared. Indifference meant someone had already left. He lingered there, hoping she might look up, soften her tone, offer something, even a sigh of regret. But Laura didn't. She returned to her laptop, typing away, her silence final. Michael walked away with a hollowness in his chest. He wasn't angry yet. He wasn't even suspicious. But something inside him shifted. He had always believed the greatest threat to marriage was conflict. But now he knew better. The greatest threat was emptiness. And emptiness had been living in their house for far too long. The hook was set. A man with everything to lose. A wife with nothing left to give. And a silence that already felt like betrayal. The audience could sense it. Even if Michael wasn't ready to admit it yet, something was terribly wrong. Dallas was not unfamiliar to Michael. But this time it felt heavier, charged with expectation. The stakes of the deal loomed over him like a mountain. The client, a global food distributor, had already prepared its exit letter. If Michael couldn't convince them to stay, his company would lose millions and risk a ripple of layoffs. He dove in with every ounce of energy he had, Days blurred into nights. PowerPoint slides into spreadsheets. Rehearsed answers into late-night revisions. He barely slept, running on black coffee and quiet determination. His team looked to him not just for direction, but for belief. And Michael delivered. He spoke with calm authority in the boardroom, laid out numbers with clarity. And when executives challenged him, he countered with solutions that made them pause. By the second day, he could feel momentum shifting. The frowns around the table began to soften. A nod here, a question there, an unspoken recognition that his plan made sense. And when the director of the client company extended his hand at the end of the final presentation, saying, "That's it. We'll keep the partnership," Michael knew he had saved the contract. He had secured a victory worth celebrating. Back at headquarters, his boss clapped him on the shoulder, eyes gleaming with approval. "You saved us, Michael. This is the kind of leadership we need in the next tier. A promotion is on the horizon." Praise rolled over him like warm applause. For years, Michael had worked for recognition like this. For years, he had carried the weight of responsibility, hoping one day to stand exactly here. But when the meeting ended and the congratulations faded, Michael didn't feel triumph. He returned to his hotel room, loosened his tie, and sat on the edge of the bed. The mirror across from him reflected a man who had delivered everything expected, yet felt strangely hollow. The silence of the room pressed in, louder than the bustling Dallas streets outside. Victories were meant to be shared. But who was there to share this with? He thought of Laura. How? Years ago, he would have called her first, his voice alive with energy, eager to hear her pride in him. Now, he hesitated. He imagined her distracted voice. A quick, "That's great," before she turned back to her laptop. He didn't dial. Instead, he sat still, hands clasped, staring at the glow of the city lights beyond the window. And then his phone buzzed. A message, not from Laura, but from an old friend who happened to be traveling in Europe. A casual note, "Look who I just ran into in Rome." Attached was a photo. Michael opened it, and the breath caught in his chest. There was Laura, seated at an outdoor cafe beneath the Roman evening glow, a glass of wine in her hand, her head tilted back in laughter, and beside her, Daniel, a colleague Michael had once suspected of getting too close. A suspicion Laura had dismissed with irritation, calling him jealous, unreasonable. But here he was, leaning close, his hand almost brushing hers on the table. They looked comfortable. They looked familiar. They looked like a couple. Michael's eyes locked on the image, every detail screaming louder than words. The short beard Daniel always kept trimmed. The way Laura had dressed, not casual, not neutral, but carefully chosen. A blouse she wore on dates years ago. The way her body leaned into his presence without hesitation. He sat frozen, staring at the screen for what felt like hours. The air conditioner hummed, the only sound in the room. His first impulse was to call her, to demand an explanation. But the thought dissolved as quickly as it came, because deep down, he didn't need to ask. The picture was not just a moment. It was confirmation of something he had ignored for too long. The strangest part was that he wasn't shocked. Not entirely. Pain. Yes. But not surprise. The truth was, their marriage had been cracking for years, fissures spreading beneath the surface. The photo simply revealed what his heart already knew. Laura had found warmth somewhere else, and she hadn't bothered to hide it anymore. He leaned back against the headboard, phone still in hand, and let the silence swallow him. For the first time, the weight of betrayal pressed fully against his chest. But even as the pain surged, another thought rose quietly within him. This wasn't the beginning of the end. It was just the proof that the end had already arrived. That night in Dallas, Michael closed his eyes with the glow of the photo still burned into his mind. A man who had just won a corporate battle, yet lost the last thread of certainty in his marriage. Victory had never felt so empty, and the audience, watching his world collapse in the quiet of a hotel room, could feel it too. The gut punch moment when suspicion turns into undeniable truth. When Michael finally returned from Dallas, suitcase in hand, he carried two things with him: the official praise of his company, and the quiet ache of a man who had seen too much truth to keep pretending. He walked through the front door with the faint hope, The foolish hope that Laura might still look up, smile, and ask how it went, that maybe she'd surprise him, prove him wrong, give him one reason to believe the photo hadn't been the whole story. Instead, Laura sat on the couch, her laptop balanced on her knees, her hair pulled back in the same casual knot she always wore at home. She looked up briefly, offered a thin smile, and said only, "Hi. How was it?" That was it. No curiosity about the project, no mention of his long nights, his sacrifice, the contract he had saved, no pride. Just 3 flat words, delivered without warmth. Michael answered with equal brevity, "Good." Nothing more. He didn't bother mentioning the deal, the handshakes, the hints of promotion. Something in him knew she didn't want to hear it. Or worse, that she didn't care. Laura closed her laptop halfway, as if offering a sliver of attention, and began to speak about Rome. She said the trip was beautiful, the city alive, the food unforgettable. Her words were polished, almost rehearsed, as if she had been preparing a casual report for this very moment. But she never once mentioned Daniel. She spoke of days spent walking, of fountains, of wine. But in her version of events, she had been entirely alone. Michael listened, his jaw tight. The photo from Dallas still burned into his mind. Betrayal, he realized, wasn't just captured in an image of 2 people at a cafe. It was sitting here in this living room, in the way Laura lied not only with words but with omissions. Betrayal was the indifference in her eyes, the hollow tone of a woman who no longer feared being caught because she no longer valued what she was losing. The silence stretched between them, heavier than any argument. And then, Michael spoke, his voice even but sharp. "Why was Daniel with you in Italy?" The question landed like a stone. Laura froze, her hands hovering over the laptop, her face flickering with something between surprise and calculation. She forced a light laugh, shaking her head as if brushing away nonsense. "What do you mean?" Michael didn't flinch. "You know exactly what I mean. I saw the photo. You and him, at a cafe in Rome, laughing like it was a honeymoon. Why was he there?" Her shoulders stiffened. She turned her gaze to the side, as though searching for a script, and finally said, "I ran into him by chance. I didn't even know he was going to Italy." Michael stepped closer, eyes locked on hers. "By chance you work together every day. You expect me to believe he just appeared in Rome, on the same streets, the same days, by coincidence?" Laura's voice sharpened. "You're overreacting, Michael. You're being dramatic. This is exactly why I didn't mention it. Because I knew you'd twist it into something it isn't." But the words rang hollow. Michael's expression didn't change. He had no jealousy to defend, only the weight of observation. "I don't need to twist anything. I saw the way you looked at him. That wasn't chance, Laura. That was choice." For a moment, her facade cracked, her eyes dropped, her lips pressed tight. She rubbed her forehead, exhaling hard, as though the effort to maintain her story was exhausting her. And then, with a trembling voice, she finally whispered, "When you said you couldn't go, I felt abandoned." Daniel overheard. He offered to come with me. I didn't want to go alone. The truth fell heavy, not explosive, but crushing in its simplicity. It wasn't about accident. It wasn't about fate. It was about a choice she had made in the silence of their marriage. A choice to seek comfort not from her husband, but from another man. Michael stood there, staring at her, the pieces of his life rearranging in real time. There were no shouts, no slammed doors, just the undeniable confirmation that what had been fragile was already broken. The betrayal was not only in Rome. It was here, in the living room, in every lie, in every shrug of indifference that had led to this moment. And as Laura lowered her head, unable to meet his eyes, Michael realized something he could never take back. The marriage hadn't ended with an affair. It had ended long before. When silence replaced love, when distance replaced care, the photo was just proof. The real betrayal was her choice to stop being his partner long before she stopped being his wife. The audience doesn't just hear his pain. They feel it. Because they know, nothing cuts deeper than a truth you already suspected, but can no longer deny. That night, after the confrontation, Michael didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam doors or throw accusations into the air. He simply walked upstairs, opened his suitcase that was still half unpacked from Dallas, and placed a few clothes inside. No explanations. No further questions, just quiet movements. The kind that speak louder than anger. Instead of sharing a bed with Laura, he carried his things down the hall to the guest room. He shut the door gently. Not in rage, but in finality. For the first time in years, he felt a strange clarity. This silence wasn't punishment. It was preparation. A line had been crossed, and there was no going back. That night he lay awake on the unfamiliar mattress, staring at the ceiling, the weight of years pressing down on him. He thought of all the birthdays celebrated half-heartedly, the anniversaries that slipped by unnoticed, the conversations that had ended before they even began. The betrayal in Rome hurt. But what stung more was the realization that Laura's absence had begun long before she ever boarded a plane. When dawn broke, Michael rose without hesitation. He showered, dressed in the first shirt he found, and drove to a small cafe near his office. He ordered a black coffee and sat at a corner table, phone in hand. For months, a colleague had told him about a reliable divorce attorney, someone fair, discreet, and efficient. Michael had ignored that advice at the time, telling himself his marriage could still be repaired. But now, with the weight of truth heavy in his chest, he scrolled through his contacts, found the number, and pressed call. The lawyer answered on the second ring. Michael's voice was steady, calm. As he explained his situation, he laid out the facts with no self-pity, no theatrics. "There's nothing left to save," he said plainly. "I want to move forward. I want to file as soon as possible." The lawyer asked for details, promised to prepare the necessary documents. When the call ended, Michael felt something unexpected. Not sorrow, but relief. For the first time in years, he had made a decision for himself. Not for appearances. Not for peacekeeping. Not for fear of what others might think. Later that afternoon, he returned home. Laura was in the kitchen, stirring a pot on the stove. The sound of the spoon against the pan was steady, almost comforting. But Michael knew comfort was a lie. He stood in the doorway and spoke with the same calm he had used on the phone. "I called a lawyer this morning. The divorce papers will be ready soon." Laura froze, spoon still in her hand. She turned slowly, her eyes wide. "What do you mean you already spoke with a lawyer?" Michael nodded. "I did, and I want this to end quickly." Her voice broke as she stepped toward him. "Michael, please. This is an exaggeration. We're hurt. We're confused. But we don't need to end it this way. Give me a chance to fix things." But Michael didn't move. He crossed his arms, his tone unshaken. "I won't waste another year on someone who doesn't care whether I come home or not. You made your choices, Laura. Now you'll have to live with them." Tears filled her eyes, her voice trembling as she reached for him. "Don't do this. I can change. We can go back." Michael stepped back, putting distance between them. His eyes were clear, his words final. "No. We can't go back. You stopped being my partner a long time ago. I just refused to see it. But I see it now." Her tears turned to quiet sobs. But they didn't move him. He wasn't cruel. He was resolute. The power had shifted. Not because he had forced it, but because he had finally claimed it. For years, Laura's silence had dictated the rhythm of their marriage. Now Michael's decision broke that silence once and for all. As he walked past her, heading upstairs to the guest room that would soon no longer be temporary, Michael felt something settle deep within him. Betrayal had wounded him, but taking control healed something larger. His dignity. That night, as he closed the door behind him, he knew the path ahead would not be easy. There would be paperwork, conversations, and moments of doubt. But none of that mattered, because the decision was made. And with it came a truth stronger than betrayal. Michael would no longer be a prisoner of indifference. The man who walked away from Laura that night wasn't broken. He was finally free. The divorce moved faster than Michael ever expected. There were no shouting matches in court. No bitter disputes over furniture or money. Just signatures on papers. Documents exchanged. And the quiet acknowledgement that two lives once intertwined were now being carefully untangled. The house was sold. The proceeds divided. Laura moved back in with her mother. Michael rented a small apartment near his office. But he knew from the first night that he wouldn't stay there long. It was as though the ink on the divorce papers freed him in more ways than one. Within weeks, his company presented him with an opportunity, a transfer to Berlin, a chance to lead a new division overseas. Years ago, he might have hesitated, worried about uprooting his life, about how Laura would take it. Now there was nothing holding him back. He accepted in less than an hour. Berlin greeted him with strangeness. The streets bustled with sounds he didn't recognize, a language that tripped on his tongue. The markets sold foods he had never tasted. Even the silence in his new apartment felt foreign. But unlike the silence he had endured at home with Laura, this silence carried possibility. It wasn't empty. It was open, at first. He buried himself in work. Long days at the office. Longer nights catching up on reports. Filling the hours so he didn't have to face the ache of loneliness. But gradually, the city began to seep into him. He walked its streets at dusk, learned the rhythm of its trains, discovered small cafes where he could sit with a book and watch the world move by. For the first time in years, he began to notice the world outside himself. It was at the office that he met Clara. She wasn't flashy or loud. She carried herself with quiet strength, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. She was thoughtful in meetings, kind in conversation, and sharp in ways that made people stop and listen. Michael noticed her not for how she looked, though she was striking in her own understated way, but for how she carried her scars. Like him, she seemed to know something of loss, of starting over. Their connection didn't begin with fireworks. It began with something smaller, safer. Shared coffees in the break room, a laugh over a mispronounced German phrase, a walk after work when the rain had cleared and neither of them wanted to head home just yet. Slowly, in the pauses between work and routine, they began to trust each other. Michael found himself speaking more freely than he had in years. He told her about Chicago, about the long marriage that had ended not with a fight but with silence. Clara didn't judge, didn't interrupt. She simply listened. And in her listening he felt something he had forgotten: presence. When she finally shared pieces of her own story, he understood why. She too had lived through disappointment, through promises broken, through the kind of loneliness that doesn't shout but lingers. There was no rush between them, no declarations, no hurried need to fill the space with labels, just companionship. A quiet companionship that grew through long walks by the river, late dinners in tucked-away restaurants, and conversations that didn't need to pretend. For Michael, this was something new. Love without lies. Love without the constant ache of indifference. He realized healing doesn't happen in one grand moment. It happens slowly. In trust rebuilt piece by piece. In laughter that feels unforced. In the comfort of sitting beside someone who doesn't need you to perform, but simply to be. He began to notice the difference in himself. The weight on his chest that had been there for years started to lift. The silence he had once dreaded no longer terrified him. With Clara, silence wasn't absence. It was peace. Berlin, once foreign and cold, started to feel like home. He knew the train lines now, had a favorite cafe, and neighbors who greeted him by name. But more than that, he had found something he hadn't dared to hope for: the beginning of trust. The seed of love. The chance to live again without fear. For the first time since the photo in Rome, Michael believed that the future could hold more than betrayal. It could hold possibility. It could hold joy. It could hold a love that was honest, steady, and real. Time passed, not in great leaps, but in steady steps, one day folding into the next, until months became years. Berlin, once a foreign city, became the backdrop of Michael's new life. The apartment that had felt temporary grew warm with laughter and conversation. What began as tentative companionship with Clara deepened into something lasting. Their bond grew quietly, without grand declarations or dramatic promises. Trust, after all, is not rebuilt overnight. It was formed in the rhythm of daily life: the way she saved him a seat at the cafe, the way he listened when she spoke of her past, the way they chose honesty, even when the truth was uncomfortable. And then, one spring morning, Clara placed a trembling hand in his and whispered that she was expecting a daughter. Michael sat in stunned silence, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that life was giving him something he thought he had lost forever. A chance to be part of a family built on trust, not on lies. The months that followed were both exhausting and joyful. Nights without sleep. Mornings filled with the soft cries of a newborn. Days learning how to be a father. Michael reduced his workload, choosing instead to spend his hours rocking his daughter to sleep, watching her tiny hand wrap around his finger. And every time he looked at Clara, he saw not just the woman who stood beside him, but the proof that healing was possible. Years later, their family grew into a rhythm of its own. The little girl learned to walk, to speak, to laugh in ways that filled the house with a sound Michael had almost forgotten existed. Dinners were lively, mornings were messy, and life was imperfect, but it was real, and it was his. In quiet moments, Michael often thought about the man he had been, the man who once lay awake in a hotel room, staring at a photo that shattered the last of his illusions. He remembered the silence of the guest room, the first call to the lawyer, the empty apartment in Berlin. Betrayal had nearly broken him, but in breaking, he discovered something stronger than anger, dignity. He had chosen not to fight with venom, but to walk away with resolve, and in that choice, he found the strength to start again. One afternoon, while feeding his daughter in the kitchen, a notification appeared on his phone, an email. The sender's name froze him for a moment. Laura. He opened it slowly. The words were short, almost stripped of emotion. She told him she had divorced Daniel. She admitted she had confused need with love, that she had wasted years trying to forgive herself. She said she had followed his journey from afar, that she was glad he had found happiness. She didn't ask for reconciliation. She didn't beg. She only wrote to say she wished him well. Michael read the message once, then set the phone down. He felt no anger, no longing, no temptation to reply. The past no longer had power over him. With a calm breath, he deleted the email. Closure doesn't always arrive with words spoken face to face. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in the simple act of moving on without regret. That night, as he tucked his daughter into bed, she looked up at him with innocent eyes and asked, "Daddy, are you happy?" He smiled, kissed her forehead, and answered firmly, "Yes. More than I ever imagined I would be." Because happiness wasn't found in the absence of pain, but in the courage to walk through it and build something new. And so the story closes with this truth. Betrayal doesn't just break a man, it remakes him. Michael lost a wife, but found something greater: truth, peace, and the strength to walk away. Men, if you were Michael, would you have taken revenge or walked away? Share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more true stories of betrayal and justice.